Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
Carlos Santana had always been a man of modest means but towering ambitions. He lived in a cramped, aging apartment on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, in a neighborhood where rusted fences and cracked pavements whispered stories of hard times. His days were spent at a small auto repair shop, smudging his hands with grease and dreaming of a life far beyond the screech of wrenches and the pungent smell of motor oil. Every week, he clung to one fragile thread of hope, his lottery ticket. It was a ritual he performed religiously, a secret prayer folded into a crumpled slip of paper bought with the last few spare coins in his pocket. The day his life change began like any other. Carlos stood at his tiny kitchen counter, peeling the lid off a can of cold beans, when the voice of the lottery announcer crackled from the ancient radio perched on a crooked shelf. He listened absent-mindedly, spoon halfway to his mouth, until the numbers began tumbling out one by one. 15, he muttered. His hand shook. 34, 59, his heart drummed a furious beat. Slowly, he unfolded his ticket, eyes darting between the paper and the voice on the radio. All 6 numbers, he whispered, the spoon clattering from his hand. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit, with the force of a tidal wave. I won. Meu Deus, I won. The next hour was a blur of disbelief and frantic calls. Friends' numbers he hadn't dialed in years suddenly filled his contact list, and the echo of his own shouts bounced off the peeling walls. He paced the room, clutching the winning ticket as though it might vanish into thin air. His thoughts raced. No more overtime at the garage, no more leaky roof, no more wishing and waiting. This was it, his ticket to freedom, the life he had dreamed of, and he would finally grasp it with both hands. Within weeks, Carlos Santana had become a name whispered with envy and admiration. The newspapers called him the mechanic who hit the jackpot, a Cinderella story for the modern age. Photographers swarmed outside his old apartment, where Dona Teresa, his mother, still lived despite its crumbling facade. She was proud, of course. Her Carlos, her hard-working boy, had finally made it. He had promised her a new home, one with fresh paint and no drafty windows, and she had smiled through tears when he kissed her cheek and said, "Just wait a little longer, May. You'll see." But promises are fragile things, easily broken when life becomes a whirlwind. Carlos's first indulgence was a sleek black convertible that purred like a contented cat. He drove it through the city with the top down, sunglasses perched on his nose, and a grin that split his face. Next came the mansion. Not just a house, but a sprawling estate with marble floors, a glittering pool, and chandeliers that caught the sunlight in prisms of gold. It was a far cry from the modest home where he had shared dinners of rice and beans with his mother, her hands calloused from years of cleaning houses to keep them afloat. He surrounded himself with the trappings of success. Designer suits that clung to his frame like they were made for him, extravagant watches that gleamed on his wrist, and a stream of glamorous parties that blurred one into the next. Women with bright smiles and sharper ambitions clung to his arm, and men who had never given him a second glance suddenly wanted to call him brother. In the beginning, he reveled in it. Every toast raised to his name felt like a vindication of the years he had spent scraping by, the times he had gone hungry so his mother could eat. He was finally someone. He basked in the admiration, drank deeply from crystal flutes, and convinced himself that he deserved it all. But beneath the glitter and glamour, a thin thread of guilt wove through his heart. Dona Teresa's calls became less frequent. The warmth in her voice, once a soothing balm to his soul, now felt like a tug on a leash he wanted to cut free. Her requests were modest: help with a leaking roof, money for the medicine her aging body needed. "I'll send it soon," he would say, his voice distracted as he thumbed through invitations to another exclusive soiree. One day, she called to tell him that the refrigerator had broken down, and the little she had left was spoiling in the summer heat. Carlos, lounging by his pool with a cocktail in hand, winced at the intrusion, "I'll take care of it," he promised. But the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. The call ended, and he tossed his phone aside, the promise forgotten as laughter and music swallowed the moment. The truth was simple. Carlos had become a man he would have despised not long ago. The fortune that had once felt like a blessing now whispered darker temptations. He believed that wealth had made him invincible, untouchable. But life has a way of collecting its debts. On a crisp autumn morning, Carlos sat in his grand living room, a fire crackling in the ornate hearth. His reflection shimmered in the polished glass of the coffee table. But he barely recognized the man staring back. A man with everything money could buy, but a soul weighed down by something money could never fix. In a rare moment of clarity, he reached for his phone to call his mother. The line rang and rang unanswered. A pang of unease tightened his chest, but he brushed it aside. "She's probably out," he muttered, "or resting." But rest was a luxury his mother could no longer afford. The sky above Sao Paulo bled a fiery orange as twilight descended over the city. In his sprawling estate, Carlos Santana reclined on a leather chaise in his private lounge, the hum of ambient jazz music filling the air. A half-empty glass of scotch sat within reach, the amber liquid catching the last rays of sunlight. His eyes wandered over the lavish surroundings, the vaulted ceilings, the imported art lining the walls, and the crystal chandeliers casting fractured light like a rain of diamonds. Yet, despite the splendor, an unease gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. His mind drifted to his mother, Dona Teresa. It had been weeks since their last conversation, weeks since she had asked for help with the broken refrigerator. He had dismissed her plight then, consumed by the demands of his newfound status. The guilt of it sat like a stone in his chest, but pride kept his hand from dialing her number. Instead, he turned his attention to the mirror across the room, admiring the figure of a man who had transformed beyond recognition. His tailored suit hugged his frame perfectly, and his gold watch glimmered against his wrist. The reflection stared back with sharp eyes, a polished smile, and a confidence built on a foundation of fortune. "Look at you," he whispered to himself. "You made it." The sound of the front door slamming shook him from his reverie. He turned his head as his old friend Lucas strode into the room, grinning like a man who had just won his own jackpot. They had known each other since childhood, back when dreams of riches were shared over games of street football on cracked asphalt. Lucas was the only friend Carlos had kept close after his windfall, though even that bond had become strained by the distance wealth creates. "Carlos," Lucas called out, spreading his arms wide. "Another party tomorrow night. You coming?" Carlos arched a brow, swirling the scotch in his glass. "What's the occasion? Do we need one?" Lucas laughed, dropping into a chair opposite him. "Just another excuse to toast your good fortune." He grabbed a cigar from the humidor on the table, cutting it with a silver blade. "Everyone will be there. Models, business moguls, the works." Carlos leaned back, his smile faint. The parties had started as celebrations of victory, but now they felt more like obligations. Faces blurred together. Names he could barely remember filled his home, each person clamoring for a piece of his success. His fortune had made him popular, but he could no longer tell who truly cared for the man he was before it all. "You know," Lucas continued, lighting the cigar with a practice flick, "you're living the dream we used to talk about. The cars, the women, the luxury. You're on top of the world." Carlos nodded, but a flicker of doubt crossed his features. "It's a lot to keep up with." "Keep up with what?" Lucas scoffed. "You've got more money than you could spend in a lifetime. Just enjoy it." Carlos smiled thinly, but a gnawing discomfort churned in his gut. Was he enjoying it? He had everything he had ever wanted, but the weight of maintaining it felt heavier than he had anticipated. That night, he wandered through the halls of his mansion, his footsteps echoing against marble floors. The silence pressed in on him, stark and unfamiliar. Wealth had brought him space, endless space, but it had also brought solitude. He paused in the grand kitchen, where countertops gleamed and stainless steel appliances stood untouched. The image of his mother's cramped, worn-out kitchen flashed in his mind. The chipped counters, the humming of the old refrigerator that had finally died. She had always made it feel warm despite its imperfections, filling it with the aroma of feijoada or fresh-baked bread. Dona Teresa, he murmured aloud, the name like a plea to a distant memory. Carlos pulled out his phone and scrolled to her number. It sat near the top of his contact list, a constant reminder of calls not returned. His finger hovered over the screen, but the same pride that had silenced him before gripped his heart again. What could he say? How could he apologize for abandoning her when he was so consumed by his own world? Before he could decide, his phone buzzed with a different call. The name Vivian appeared on the screen, a model he had been seeing on and off. She was beautiful, with long legs and a smile that dazzled in magazine spreads, but their conversations were shallow and filled with artifice. "Carlos," she purred when he answered, "I was just thinking about you. Come pick me up tonight. I'm bored." He hesitated, the warmth he had felt for his mother fading under the weight of temptation. "Where are you?" "Downtown. Let's go to that rooftop bar. You know, the one with the gold couches. I want champagne." The call ended, and he stood in the empty kitchen, the screen of his phone dark once more. His shoulders sagged under the realization that he had chosen distraction over meaning yet again. The next morning, a letter arrived. It was a plain envelope, handwritten, with smudged ink that bore the signs of careworn fingers. It stood out among the glossy invitations and financial statements that crowded his marble-topped desk. He opened it slowly, the scent of lavender soap, his mother's signature, rising from the paper. "My son," he began, "I have not heard from you in many weeks. I hope you are well and happy. I pray for you every night. Things are difficult here, but I know God provides. The neighbors have been kind, sharing food when I cannot afford more. I am thankful for their generosity, though I miss the days when it was just you and me at our little table. I still have your old chair waiting for you. With all my love, your May, Teresa." The words cut through him like a knife. His chest tightened, and a deep ache spread from his heart to the tips of his fingers. He pictured her sitting alone, the woman who had sacrificed everything so he could dream, now depending on strangers' charity. Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them away, setting the letter down with trembling hands. His jaw clenched as shame coursed through him. How had he let it come to this? Carlos sank into the chair by his desk, gripping the edges as if to steady himself. The mansion, the cars, the parties. None of it filled the void that grew wider with each passing day. His wealth had bought him everything he had wanted, but at what cost? He sat there for a long time, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The weight of his choices pressed heavier than ever. The sun cast long shadows across the vast front lawn of Carlos Santana's estate, where perfectly trimmed hedges framed a circular driveway. The place was immaculate, a showcase of wealth and privilege. Yet inside, Carlos sat in the dim light of his study, his mother's letter still clutched in his hands like a lifeline to a simpler time. Her words echoed in his mind. "I still have your old chair waiting for you." The image of her frail figure, sitting at their modest kitchen table, refused to leave him. A hollow ache throbbed in his chest, a guilt that no amount of money could silence. He pushed back from the polished mahogany desk and paced the room, each step reverberating against marble tiles. His breath quickened as self-recriminations took hold. "What kind of son abandons his mother?" he muttered, his voice thick with regret. He thought of her working tirelessly when he was a boy, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, her smile unwavering despite the burden she carried. She had always managed to keep food on the table, even if it meant going hungry herself. She had saved every spare coin for his education, never letting him feel how hard her life truly was. And now, she was surviving on the kindness of neighbors, while he was drowning in luxury. Carlos slammed a fist onto the desk. The sharp crack of impact echoed in the silence, a futile outburst against the crushing weight of his conscience. Enough was enough. He grabbed his car keys from the side table and marched through the cavernous halls of his mansion. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over the pristine interior, a place filled with objects he had once thought would bring happiness. Custom furniture, rare paintings, a wine collection worth more than most people's yearly salaries. All of it felt meaningless now. When he opened the garage door, a fleet of luxury cars gleamed under the bright overhead lights. The sleek convertible beckoned, but for once, it did not fill him with pride. Instead, he felt only a bitter pang of emptiness. As he sped through the city, the neighborhoods transformed before his eyes. Towering glass buildings gave way to narrow streets lined with small shops and crowded markets. The vibrant energy of the city pulsed around him, but Carlos barely noticed. His mind was consumed with the past. Memories of simpler times when joy had come from sharing meals with his mother, not from owning things. Finally, he reached the street where he had grown up. The sight of the old neighborhood hit him like a punch to the gut. The houses were small and worn, their paint peeling, their roofs patched with mismatched tiles. Children played barefoot in the narrow alleys, their laughter reminding him of his own childhood. Long before ambition had swallowed his innocence, he pulled up in front of the house. The gate was rusted, the garden overgrown. The mailbox leaned crookedly, stuffed with uncollected letters. He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding as he approached the front door. He knocked once. The sound seemed to echo for an eternity. When no answer came, he knocked again more urgently. "Mom," he called, his voice trembling. "It's me, Carlos." Silence. Fear gripped his chest as he reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar, worn interior of the home he had abandoned. The scent of lavender still lingered faintly in the air, the same soap his mother had always used. The kitchen was just as he remembered, but now it felt smaller, sadder. The refrigerator stood in the corner, its door propped open with a cracked bowl. The shelves inside were nearly bare, a carton of milk long past its expiration date, a few wilted greens, and a single loaf of stale bread. His throat tightened as he took in the sight. She had been living like this while he had feasted on caviar and champagne. He moved through the house, calling her name with growing desperation. In the small living room, the faded armchair where she used to sit remained in its place, a knitted blanket draped over the back. His eyes landed on a photograph framed on the wall, a younger version of himself with his mother, their smiles bright and full of hope. A tear slid down his cheek as he turned toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. He pushed the door open. There she was. Donna Teresa lay on a narrow bed, her form small and fragile beneath a thin quilt. Her silver hair framed a face lined with the marks of a life spent in sacrifice. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with labored effort. "Mom," Carlos whispered, falling to his knees beside her. He took her hand in his. It was cold and frail, the veins like delicate blue rivers beneath her skin. "I'm here. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that had once been filled with warmth and strength. They softened as they focused on his face. A weak smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Carlos, you came." Her voice was barely a whisper. Tears streamed down his face as he clung to her hand. "I should have come sooner. I should have taken care of you. I let you down." A faint chuckle escaped her lips, a sound that was both painful and beautiful. "You were always my dream, Filio. Not the money. You..." Her words shattered him. He had chased fortune, believing it would honor her sacrifices, but she had never wanted wealth. She had only wanted him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Carlos stayed by her side, holding her hand as night fell. He whispered promises he should have kept long ago, vowing to never forget the true meaning of love and family again. And as she rested, her breathing steady but fragile, he felt the weight of his choices and the long road to redemption that lay ahead. The room was dim, lit only by the flicker of a small lamp on the bedside table. Carlos Santana sat motionless, his mother's frail hand clasped gently in his own. He watched as her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one a painful reminder of how much time had been stolen by his neglect. Guilt tightened around his heart like a vice, but it wasn't just guilt anymore. It was determination. Dona Teresa deserved better, far better than what he had given her. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, painting the small bedroom in muted gold. Carlos hadn't slept. He sat hunched in a chair by the bed, eyes red from tears and fatigue. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, breaking the heavy silence. It was Lucas. Carlos ignored the call, but the screen lit up again moments later. The notifications piled up, messages from acquaintances, invitations to parties, and one from Vivian, asking why he hadn't shown up the night before. The constant buzzing grated on his nerves until, in a sudden burst of frustration, he grabbed the phone and powered it off. None of that mattered anymore. He turned his attention back to his mother, whose eyelids fluttered open at the sound. Her gaze was weak but full of warmth. "Carlos," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I'm here, May," he said softly, leaning closer. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You shouldn't waste time sitting here with me. You have your own life." Her words stabbed him deeper than any accusation could have. How could she still care about his life when hers had been reduced to this? "No," he said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my life, May, and I'm going to make things right." Later that morning, Carlos stepped outside to make a series of calls. His mother had always been too proud to ask for help, and he had failed her by not seeing through that pride sooner. He wouldn't fail again. The first call was to a private doctor. The man arrived within an hour, a middle-aged professional with a calm demeanor and a leather bag full of medical tools. Carlos watched anxiously as the doctor examined Dona Teresa, listening to her breathing and checking her vitals. "She's weak but stable," the doctor concluded, glancing at Carlos. "Her condition isn't critical, but she'll need proper care and nutrition and rest to recover fully." Carlos nodded, relief flooding through him. "I'll make sure she has everything she needs." The doctor gave him a list of medications and dietary requirements, and Carlos set out immediately. He drove to the nearest pharmacy, his convertible standing out like a sore thumb in the modest neighborhood. He noticed the stares from the locals, some curious, others judgmental. For the first time, he felt ashamed of the flashy car. It was a monument to his selfishness, a symbol of everything he had chosen over his mother. When he returned, he carried bags of medicine, fresh groceries, and nutritional supplements into the house. He stocked the empty fridge, cleaned the kitchen, and prepared a simple soup under his mother's watchful gaze. "You're cooking?" she asked weakly, a hint of humor in her tone. He chuckled softly. "Don't look so surprised. I learned a few things over the years. Not as good as your feijoada, but it'll do." Her laughter, faint as it was, warmed his heart. Days turned into weeks, and Carlos poured himself into caring for Dona Teresa. He canceled every event, ignored every social call, and withdrew from the world he had once reveled in. His friends, if they could even be called that, began to notice his absence. Lucas showed up uninvited one evening, dressed in a tailored suit and wearing a confused expression. He found Carlos in the small living room, sitting beside his mother and reading aloud from an old, dog-eared novel she loved. "Carlos," Lucas said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here? You've been off the radar for weeks." Carlos looked up, his expression calm but firm. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Lucas scoffed, glancing around the modest home. "This? You're living here? What happened to the mansion, the parties, the life we dreamed about?" Carlos set the book aside and stood, walking over to face his old friend. "That life isn't what I thought it would be. None of it meant anything without her." He gestured toward his mother, who smiled faintly from the couch. Lucas frowned. "But you're throwing it all away. People are going to think you've lost your mind." Carlos's voice hardened. Let them think what they want. I lost myself chasing a dream that wasn't worth it. Now I'm finding my way back. Lucas stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. You're making a mistake, Carlos. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out the door. Carlos watched him go, feeling no regret. For the first time in years, he was doing what felt right. As the weeks passed, Carlos began to reconnect with the life he had left behind. He repaired the house, replacing the leaky roof and fixing the broken appliances. He spent time with his mother, rediscovering the simple joys of conversation, laughter, and shared meals. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Donna Teresa reached over and took his hand. Her strength had begun to return, her cheeks no longer hollow, her eyes brighter. "You've done so much for me, Filio," she said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Carlos shook his head. "Taking care of you is what's taking care of me, May. I lost my way, but you've brought me back." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "You always had a good heart, Carlos. Money doesn't change that. Only you can. I'm proud of you." Her words filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Carlos prepared dinner, he received an unexpected call from his financial advisor. The man sounded tense, explaining that Carlos's fortune was dwindling due to his inactivity in managing his investments. The parties, the lavish purchases, and the sudden halt in generating income had taken their toll. Carlos listened calmly, surprising even himself. "Do whatever needs to be done to stabilize things," he said. "But understand this. Money isn't my priority anymore." The advisor hesitated. "Are you sure, Mr. Santana? You could lose everything if you're not careful." Carlos smiled as he glanced toward the living room, where his mother sat knitting a scarf. "I already have everything I need." As he hung up, he realized the truth in his words. He had been chasing wealth to fill a void, but it had been his mother's love and the values she had instilled in him that gave his life meaning. Carlos made a silent vow. He would use what remained of his fortune to honor her sacrifices and ensure that no one else in their community would have to endure what she had. For the first time in years, Carlos Santana felt truly rich. The autumn air carried a soft chill as Carlos Santana sat on the porch beside his mother, the simple wooden chair creaking under his weight. A pot of chamomile tea rested on the small table between them, steam curling lazily into the crisp afternoon air. Birds chirped from a nearby tree, their song a melody of peace that had eluded him for so long. His fingers traced the edge of a ceramic mug as he soaked in the tranquility of the moment. Donna Teresa, now stronger and more vibrant, glanced at her son with a warmth that only a mother could possess. Her cheeks had regained their color, and a spark of life danced in her eyes. She had been knitting a scarf, the rhythmic click of needles a comforting sound that reminded Carlos of his childhood. "You're quiet today, Filio," she observed gently. "What's on your mind?" Carlos smiled, a soft curve of the lips that carried both joy and sorrow. "I've been thinking about everything I've done and everything I still need to do." Her hand stilled, and she placed the half-finished scarf on her lap. "You've already done more than enough. Being here with me, taking care of the house, it's more than I ever hoped for." He shook his head slowly. "It's not enough. Not just for you, but for others too. I've seen things differently now. I know how easy it is to get lost chasing things that don't matter, while people go without." She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "The world is full of people in need, Carlos. You can't carry it all on your shoulders." "I know," he said quietly, "but I can start small, right here, where I grew up." The next morning, Carlos set his plan into motion. He called the local community center, a place that had once been a haven for him and his friends when they were children. He remembered afternoons spent playing football on the dusty field, free lunches that filled empty stomachs, and volunteers who taught life skills to kids with dreams far bigger than their circumstances. When the phone picked up, a familiar voice greeted him. Senor Amaral, the man who had run the center for decades, sounded older now, but the kindness in his voice hadn't faded. "Carlos Santana." "What a surprise," Amaral exclaimed. "It's been too long." Carlos's heart clenched with nostalgia. "It has, Senor Amaral. I'm sorry I stayed away for so long. I want to help now. Whatever the center needs, renovations, supplies, programs, I'll cover the costs." There was a pause on the line, and when Amaral spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "You always had a big heart, Carlos. I never doubted you'd find your way back." They arranged a meeting for the following week, and Carlos felt a renewed sense of purpose. In the days that followed, he began laying the groundwork for broader efforts. His fortune had shrunk, but there was still enough to make a difference if used wisely. He consulted with local leaders, teachers, and community members, listening to their needs and ideas. He commissioned repairs for the school roof, funded scholarships for students with big dreams, and created a food program for families struggling to put meals on the table. The work was fulfilling, and for the first time in years, Carlos felt truly connected to his roots. He no longer sought approval from socialites or clung to the fleeting thrill of extravagant living. Instead, he found joy in every smiling child, every heartfelt thank you, and the pride that came from giving back. One day, while overseeing renovations at the community center, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he saw Lucas, his childhood friend, looking out of place amid the scaffolding and noise of construction. "Didn't think I'd see you here," Lucas said with a half-smile. Carlos wiped his hands on his jeans and gestured around. "This is where it all started for us. I figured it was time to come back." Lucas crossed his arms, his brow furrowing. "You really gave it all up, huh? The mansion, the cars, everything?" Carlos met his gaze with calm certainty. "Not everything. I kept what mattered." Lucas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't get it before. I thought you were crazy. But seeing you here, maybe I was wrong." Carlos smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him. "It's never too late to make a different choice, Lucas." For the first time in their conversation, Lucas's eyes softened. "Maybe you're right." That evening, Carlos returned home to his mother. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a loaf of fresh bread cooling on the counter beside her. The house smelled of warmth and comfort, a scent he had missed for far too long. He kissed her on the cheek before sitting down. "How was your day?" she asked. "Busy," he replied, smiling. "But good. We're making progress at the community center. The kids will have a new playground soon." Dona Teresa beamed with pride. "You've become the man I always knew you could be." Carlos looked at her, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "The greatest fortune is the one we build in the hearts of others. You understand that now." He nodded, the truth of her words settling deep in his soul. And for the first time in a long while, Carlos Santana felt truly rich. The summer sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood that Carlos Santana once called home. Children's laughter filled the air as they raced across the newly paved playground at the community center. The metallic clink of a football being kicked and the rhythmic squeak of swings filled Carlos with a sense of contentment that he hadn't known in years. Standing at the edge of the playground, he watched as a group of boys formed teams for a match. He recognized one of them, a wiry kid with a fierce grin who reminded him of himself at that age. The boy, Rafael, kicked the ball with such skill and passion that it stirred something deep within Carlos, a memory of dreams that had once felt limitless. "Hey, Rafael," Carlos called, smiling as the boy ran over, his face flushed with excitement. "You've got talent. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The boy grinned. "You think so, Senor Santana? I know so. Just remember, the greatest players don't play for themselves. They play for the team. Stick with your friends and you'll go far." Rafael nodded seriously, absorbing the advice as if it were gospel. "Will you come watch our championship next week?" Carlos's heart swelled with pride. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As the boy darted back to his friends, Carlos turned toward the community center, where construction workers were putting the final touches on the refurbished building. Bright, fresh paint covered the once faded walls, and new windows reflected the sunlight. The sight filled him with a deep sense of accomplishment. Inside, he found Senior Admiral reviewing plans for upcoming after-school programs. The elderly man's eyes crinkled with gratitude as Carlos approached. "This place has become something special again," Admiral said, clapping a hand on Carlos's shoulder. "It's because of you." Carlos shook his head humbly. "No, it's because of us. Everyone who believed in what this neighborhood could be. I just had the means to make it happen." The older man chuckled. "You always had the heart. That's more valuable than any fortune." Carlos felt a warmth spread through his chest, but the moment was bittersweet. His savings were nearly depleted. He had poured almost everything he had into the projects that had transformed his old neighborhood. The mansion was sold, the expensive cars long gone. What remained was enough for a modest life, one free of extravagance, but full of purpose. That night, he returned to the small home where he now lived with his mother. The kitchen was filled with the scent of her famous feijoada simmering on the stove. She was humming a tune, a song from his childhood, as she stirred the pot. "May," he said softly, stepping behind her and placing his hands on her shoulders. "It smells perfect, as always." She laughed, patting his hand. "I had a good teacher, necessity." Carlos chuckled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that she noticed immediately. "What is it, Meufilio? What's troubling you?" He sighed and sat at the table. "I've spent most of the money, May. There isn't much left." Her face softened with understanding. She walked over, sat beside him, and took his hand in both of hers. "And how do you feel?" she asked. "Free," he said after a long pause. "For the first time, I feel free." Her eyes glistened with pride. "Then you are richer than you ever were." The following week, the neighborhood gathered for the opening ceremony of the refurbished community center. Families brought food, children played, and laughter echoed through the streets. Carlos stood at the front of the crowd, a modest figure in simple clothes, a far cry from the flashy man who had once basked in wealth. When it was time for him to speak, he stepped up to the podium. He looked out over the faces of his friends, neighbors, and people he had once forgotten. His mother stood in the front row, her eyes shining with love. He cleared his throat, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "When I was a boy, this place was my second home," he began. "It was here that I learned about hope, kindness, and the power of community. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of those things. I chased dreams of fortune, thinking that money would bring me happiness. I was wrong." He paused, his voice steady but full of passion. "True wealth isn't in the things we own. It's in the lives we touch, the people we lift up, and the love we share. I've learned that lesson the hard way, but I'm grateful for the chance to make things right." The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on him, hanging on his every word. This center is more than just bricks and paint. It's a symbol of what we can do when we come together. It's a place where dreams are born and nurtured, and it belongs to all of us. He stepped back from the podium, and the crowd erupted into applause. Children cheered, parents clapped, and his mother's smile shone brighter than the sun. As the festivities continued, Carlos sat quietly by the edge of the playground, watching life unfold around him. The burdens of the past had lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. Raphael ran by, kicking the ball with fierce determination, his laughter echoing into the evening sky. Senior Admiral sat down beside him, a knowing smile on his face. "You've found your place again," Admiral said softly. Carlos nodded. "I think I have." The older man tilted his head. "And what's next for you?" Carlos took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. "Whatever comes, I'll face it with open hands and a full heart." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And as the stars began to twinkle, Carlos Santana sat among his people, a man who had once been lost but was now truly found.